Most people who watched John Lennon on Dick Cavett Show in 1971 saw exactly what they expected. A confident, articulate, occasionally funny man talking about peace and music and his life in New York. What they didn't see was that at the exact moment those cameras were rolling, the United States government was working to remove him from the country. The Lennon appearances on the Dick Cavett Show, spread across 1971 and 1972, were among the most watched talk show segments of that era. Lennon was, by that point, the most famous musician alive, and he had chosen New York as his home with the deliberateness of someone who had thought carefully about where he wanted to be. He and Yoko Ono had moved to Greenwich Village in 1971. He was making political music. Imagine had been released that year, and he was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement in ways that had drawn the attention of people in Washington who were not his admirers. On Cavett's show, he discussed all of it openly, the music, the politics, the peace activism, with the kind of calm, direct intelligence that made him a compelling television presence. Cavett, who genuinely enjoyed talking to him, asked him once about the government's efforts to deport him, and Lennon answered the way he answered most things, directly, with a kind of humor that had something harder underneath it. "I love this country more than the people trying to remove me from it do," he said. "That's what they can't quite forgive." The room laughed. Lennon moved on. The cameras moved on. But he was not joking about the country, and he was not joking about the forgiveness. To understand what was actually happening during those Cavett appearances, you have to understand the specific machinery that had been set in motion against John Lennon by the time he sat down across from Dick Cavett. John Winston Lennon was born in Liverpool in October 1940 during a German air raid. His father, Alfred, was a merchant seaman who was mostly absent. His mother, Julia, was warm and musical and not quite able to raise him. He was taken in by her sister Mimi, who did raise him, strictly and with love, in a semi-detached house in the Liverpool suburb of Woolton. He was a difficult student and a gifted one. The teachers who saw the gift and the teachers who only saw the difficulty disagreed sharply about what to do with him. He left school, started a band, played skiffle and early rock and roll in Liverpool basements and then in Hamburg clubs. And by 1963, the Beatles existed in a form that the world was about to discover all at once. The decade that followed, the Beatles, the solo career, the peace activism with Yoko, is sufficiently well documented that the outline is familiar to almost everyone. What is less familiar is the specific reason the Nixon administration decided in 1972 that John Lennon needed to be removed from the United States. The reason was not drugs, though a 1968 drug conviction in England provided the legal pretext. The reason was a concert. Specifically, the plan, which was being discussed among Lennon's activist connections in early 1972, to organize a national concert tour that would register young voters and campaign against Nixon's re-election in the November 1972 election. The Nixon administration, informed of this plan by Senator Strom Thurmond in a memo that has since become public record, moved quickly. The Immigration and Naturalization Service began deportation proceedings against Lennon in March 1972, citing the 1968 drug conviction. Lennon's visa was not renewed. He was told he had 60 days to leave the country. He refused to go. He hired lawyers. He filed appeals. He appeared at press conferences outside the INS offices in New York, and he continued making music and doing interviews and living in the city he had chosen, as if the deportation proceedings were a problem to be solved rather than a verdict to be accepted. which, as it turned out, they were. But that outcome was not visible from where he stood in 1972. What made the legal fight unusual, beyond its subject, was its duration. The case dragged on for 4 years, from 1972 until 1976, when a federal appeals court finally ruled in Lennon's favor, and he received his permanent resident status, his green card, the document that said he could stay. During those 4 years, he appeared on Cavett's show, made albums, appeared at public events, and lived in New York with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who intended to remain there, regardless of what the government decided. There was no point during those 4 years, by Lennon's own account, at which he seriously considered simply leaving. The America that John Lennon had chosen, that he was, through those 4 years fighting to remain part of, was not the America of the Nixon administration, or the INS, or the senators who had written memos about him. It was a specific, particular America. Greenwich Village, Lower Manhattan, the American avant-garde tradition that he had been in conversation with since the mid-1960s through Yoko. It was the America of Allen Ginsberg and the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests and the particular creative energy of New York in the early 1970s that was unlike anything happening anywhere else in the world. He had arrived in New York in 1971 and had felt immediately that he was somewhere he needed to be. This was not naive romanticism. Lennon was, by 1971, a sufficiently clear-eyed person to understand that America had a great many qualities that were not admirable. The Vietnam War was one of them. The treatment of its own citizens who dissented was another. But he also understood, and said this in various forms to Cavett and to other interviewers, that the things America was capable of being were different from the things it currently was, and that the distance between those two versions of the country was something worth working on, rather than simply observing from outside it. I love this country more than the people trying to remove me from it do. On Cavett's show, it landed as a sharp, well-constructed line, delivered with impeccable timing. It was also, stated as plainly as Lennon ever stated anything, his actual position. He was not performing defiance for the cameras. He was describing, with complete accuracy, why he would not leave. The music Lennon made during those years. Imagine, Happy Christmas, War is Over. The Sometime in New York City album was directly shaped by what was happening around him politically and legally. Sometime in New York City, in particular, was a record that addressed specific ongoing events: the Attica prison uprising, women's rights, the situation in Northern Ireland, the deportation proceedings against himself. Critics at the time found it too direct, too journalistic, insufficiently musical. Lennon disagreed. He thought that what was happening in the world was exactly what music should be about, and that the claim that politics and art should be separate was itself a political position, the position of people who preferred the world to stay as it was. On Cavett's show, the conversations about his music and about the deportation proceedings were intertwined in a way that Cavett, to his credit, did not try to separate. He asked about the music, and then about the legal situation, and then about the music again. And Lennon moved between the two subjects with the ease of someone who didn't experience them as separate things. What he was making and what he was fighting for were, by that point, the same thing. The music was about staying. The staying was, among other things, about the music. The deportation case was finally resolved on October 7th, 1975. John and Yoko's son, Sean, was born the following day, on John's 35th birthday. The Federal Appeals Court ruled that the 1968 British drug conviction could not be used as grounds for deportation under American immigration law. Lennon received his permanent resident status, his green card, in July 1976. He had been fighting for it for 4 years. He held it up at the press conference, smiled, and said something about how he was glad to finally be legal. He was killed in New York on December 8, 1980. He had been living in the city for 9 years by then. He had never left. The green card he had fought for 4 years to receive was found in his pocket. Going back to those Cavett appearances now, the easy back and forth, the sharp lines, the composed, sometimes funny man talking about America as if he owned the conversation. They looked different, knowing what was happening on the other side of the camera. The confidence was real, but it was not effortless. It was the confidence of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it completely, who had looked at the options and decided that the option of simply leaving was not one he was willing to take. Not because he was reckless or naive or unaware of the power of the government that was trying to remove him, but because he genuinely believed that the place he had chosen mattered, that New York specifically, and America in some larger sense, was worth staying for. I love this country more than the people trying to remove me from it do. In the context of what was actually happening when he said it, the INS proceedings, the lawyers, the 4-year legal battle already underway, the line was not a performance, it was a position. He meant exactly what he said, delivered it with perfect timing because that was how he spoke, and moved the conversation on because that was what the moment called for. John Lennon lived in New York for 9 years. He walked the streets of the Upper West Side. He took Sean to Central Park. He recorded in the city, worked in the city, was part of the city in the specific, daily way that only comes from choosing to stay somewhere through difficulty and uncertainty and 4 years of legal proceedings that could have ended differently. The Dick Cavett appearances from those years are, among other things, a record of what that staying looked like from the outside. The composure, the intelligence, the humor that never fully covered the seriousness underneath. A man on live television discussing with considerable wit the government's attempts to remove him from the country he had chosen, making it look like something other than the fight it actually was. He was, in the end, right about the country. The courts agreed with him. He got his green card. He stayed. New York kept him for 9 years. Then it didn't. But he never left voluntarily. That was the thing he had said on Cavett Show and had meant completely. And that, in the end, was what happened.